I started the work with trauma, working with individuals. I found this little ad in the University of Washington daily newspaper that said volunteers needed at the Seattle Rape Relief, which was a rape crisis center. So I responded to that ad. I got trained as an advocate, and that was in 1976. I started working not only with rape victims, but also doing education in schools, with clergy, with medical professionals. I found that across the board, people had no idea how much trauma there is, how much interpersonal trauma. By 1978, I was also working with victims of physical assault, battering, mostly women and children, but also some men. And I have to tell you, I didn't go into this work thinking, yeah, I want to work with trauma. I want to work with really hard things, but it's where I got called. And it's where I keep being called. So I started doing that work. And in 81, I moved to Alaska. And there I worked with sexual assault and domestic violence in the three urban areas, Juneau, Fairbanks, Anchorage, and also in the villages, helping people think through how to create culturally appropriate responses to trauma. My own background, my father's full-blooded German, and I was raised actually on military bases, 10 years in Germany. My mother is a combination of Blackfoot, Kainai from Southern Alberta, Scots, and from Wales. So I have this whole background that really, again, called me to do work with both military families and Indigenous communities. In 91, I moved back to the Seattle area, and my colleague and I, Pat Vivian, who trained with me in 76 at Seattle Rape Relief, she and I started talking about organizational cultures and how one of the things we knew was that a culture of an organization tends to echo the work that it does. So we found that there were a fair number of victim dynamics in rape crisis work, in domestic violence work, in child welfare work. For example, one of the groups we worked with was a group that did work with runaway teenagers. And that staff team had a very difficult time doing long-term planning. And we were working with a student who worked there. And one of the things she said is, none of the teenagers who come to us do long-term planning because they don't expect to live out of their teenage years. And so this staff team starts adopting those values and that perspective. In 99, Pat Vivian, my colleague, said to me, do you think it's possible for an entire organization to be traumatized? I'm working with an organization right now that when I talk with the staff, it sounds like I'm working with a victim of sexual assault. Well, that was really intriguing. And we started then to think about, what is that organizational trauma? And as you can imagine, there was very little in the literature in 99 and 2000. We did find Howard Stein, the University of Oklahoma, who started writing after the Oklahoma bombing. In 2001, he actually talked about 9/11 as a national trauma. And he was a great input to us about what organizational trauma is, about how any kind of trauma actually gets through any protective membrane, whether it's individual trauma, whether I'm working with someone who has trauma and their trauma material gets through my boundaries and I don't address that and develop secondary trauma, whether it's with an organization. I can give you a mild example of organizational trauma. It will seem mild to you. It is not mild to the organization. When a church, a synagogue, a temple, any kind of spiritual place gets threatened repeatedly, a Black church is bombed, and the threat is implicit from there on. A temple or a mosque is defaced, and over and over. And the threat continues and lives in the body of that organization. So one of the things about organizational trauma is that the collective experience comes in to the organizational culture and lives there. People asked us in the beginning of our work, why do organizational trauma? Why not keep focusing on individual trauma, right? We know about post-traumatic stress. We know that secondary trauma can come from hearing so much trauma material from others, especially children. We know that vicarious trauma also happens when we hear about other people's trauma material, and it actually changes our worldview. So I had a faculty member say to me once, I knew I had to stop doing work at the domestic violence shelter because I was just walking down the street thinking, oh, I'll bet he beats his wife. I'll bet he beats his wife. That shift of worldview, of not being able to see the healthy and the resilient, not being able to see the love, right? And one of the things we know about trauma at every level is that it isolates. Judith Herman made this very clear to us in her book, right? She was one of the first to write about sexual assault as being as traumatic as what someone experiences in war. That post-traumatic stress disorder is very real for victims of assault, of any kind of assault. So here Pat and I are on this road exploring what the heck is organizational trauma. Well, we had our first case study when the organization that we loved, trained with, met each other, when Seattle Rape Relief closed. And there was a very small paragraph in the paper that said they closed because of finances. Well, we knew that wasn't probably true because they had federal money and state money and foundation money, and they had money. We took it on ourselves to interview every executive director across its 30-year history. We interviewed staff and board across all the decades, and we developed a case study that said, this organization lost heart and folded. It imploded. And in fact, when it ended, they had reduced, the board had dropped off to 5 people. And of that 5 people, they voted 3-2 to close. Now that is heartbreaking to me. And one of the pieces of that that's heartbreaking is that the agency had gone through really hard times in its history. Most nonprofits do, and especially if they're dealing with violence. And in the past, when that happened, they had opened up to the community. They had opened and said, we need assistance. Come on along, come aboard. And in this case, they shut down. They isolated, they closed their boundaries, they just tightened it way, way down. That was a very hard period. And it was a great lesson for us. We really started to look at what are the dynamics. And so when we wrote the book, Organizational Trauma and Healing, we were focused on nonprofit organizations. That's where we were grounded. And most of our work was with sexual assault agencies and domestic violence organizations. We have since expanded a lot. I have done a lot of work with teachers, with school nurses, with university personnel. I've done a lot of work across the spectrum of education, for example. I've done work in tribal communities. Pat and I have both done work with the Coast Guard. I've done work with other military folks. So I've done work with businesses. I have to say, organizational trauma is pervasive. It's pervasive and it often doesn't get identified. People think, well, this is a crisis, and they think they see light at the end of the tunnel, and then it gets murkier and murkier and more hurtful, and they honestly can't figure out what they're in the middle of. Or people think this is an interpersonal problem, or this is a team problem, or this is an individual problem. And they don't look systemically at what are the dynamics. What are the patterns of behavior? It's those patterns that aren't about being personal, right? They're about what happens in our organizational culture that we often don't even notice because, like fish swimming in water, like the air that we breathe, we don't notice the culture often. We frankly don't pay attention. And sometimes the patterns and the dynamics are quite negative. And it's when productivity really suffers, when turnover gets radically high, that we say something may be wrong here. And if we could identify it much earlier than that, we can in fact keep those good people who work for us. We can, in fact, shift the dynamics in our organization. Over the years, we have learned a lot about working with organizational trauma and various populations. So, for example, when I work with a group and they don't use the language of trauma or they're not comfortable with trauma, that's fine. Let's talk about organizational health. Let's talk about the health of staff, the health of teachers. Let's talk about compassion fatigue. Charles Figley uses that language, compassion fatigue, that one of the things that happens when we're using empathy constantly and sharing our compassion is that we end up with an empty reservoir. We end up fatigued. We end up without what we need to do our work, which is empathy and compassion. And he talks a lot. He comes out of schools of social work, and he talks a lot about our need for boundaries and our need for paying ongoing attention to health. Well, so take that to the pattern level of organizations, that we want organizations to pay attention to the health of their staff and to the health of their caregivers, right? When I work with firefighters or with law enforcement personnel, they'll talk about critical incident debrief. They'll talk about the need to have a collective response, and it's not mandatory. So, for example, one time I was working with firefighters and EMTs who took part in a pretty horrendous situation. And nobody, I mean, there were, I don't know, 30, 40 people involved. Nobody was mandated to come and talk. It was completely open. Well, about half did at 2 different sessions. And they didn't talk about trauma. And in fact, they tried to figure out some way to pull on their strengths, to pull on humor, to pull on dark humor. And one of the things I said in those sessions is, you did a good job. Thank you. The whole community is so grateful for what you did. And that is really, really helpful. It was really helpful to the people who were there. And they could say that to each other. And what they did not do was go into the details of what they had to deal with. That would have been rehashing the trauma. They all knew what happened. They did not need to go there. My colleague Pat tells a very interesting story about a domestic violence shelter where a man shot and killed his wife outside the shelter. And a month later, Pat went and met with the staff as a whole, everyone, whether they were there that day or not, the receptionists, the clinical people, everybody. Now, one of the advantages to that was that having a couple of weeks to a month out meant that people were through the initial shock. And again, she brought them all together, not to rehash what happened, but for each person to have a little bit of time to tell their story and reaction, so that you now have a collective story. You now have the collective understanding and learning from one another how they have been dealing and what they want to do collectively going forward. I worked with a staff team where a young girl got in the crossfire of a gang, and she was shot and killed. And there were people in the community, and it was very upsetting. And what they chose to do was to plant a bush in her honor. And every year then that would bloom. So that kind of life and symbols and remembering are important to us. When I worked at a tribal college, we had a staff member, a teacher, who died suddenly. And of course, people were very sad and very grieving. And we came together a couple of times to tell stories about her. And frankly, to check in with one another. That's another advantage of the collective, right? You get to sort of check in with each other. And they set up a lovely table in her memory that had sacred cedar and had a picture of her and had some of her favorite food, which were Cheetos. and you know, it wasn't like a big, you know, everybody has to remember her. It was set aside, but for a month it was there. And we could walk by and just say a prayer for her as we went by. That was quite a lovely remembering. And I bring these stories up because with trauma, there is grief. There isn't always death. There isn't always death of an organization. There isn't always death of an individual. There is grief. Things are painful. People may be suffering. There is grief. We have to acknowledge that. And it doesn't mean we stop working, right? It doesn't. We carry on. We do what we need to do in our work. However, if we don't acknowledge the grief, we don't acknowledge one another, that is actually quite disrespectful. The very values that we say we hold and that we want to use with children, with the people we work with, we don't allow one another, right? And if in fact system-wide, we are holding those values, then we know those values are showing up with how we work with kids and how we work with other folks in the system. I'd like to just briefly share with you the types of organizational trauma that I've seen. Pat, Vivian, and I have worked on this, as I've said, since 2000, 1999, 2000. That means we've had 21 years of examples from a lot of people. The first type is a single devastating event. And that could be internal to the organization or external to the organization. A single devastating event could be a school shooting, could be a beloved staff member who dies, could be embezzlement, could be the sudden eruption of finding out that there's been sexual abuse by somebody in a congregation or somebody in power in a school. So it could be external from the outside, or it could be internal, happening from inside. And those events are the ones we tend to hear about. They're often on the news. We often say, how can these shootings continue? And they do. And each one is so impactful in the organization and in the community. The next is ongoing wounding. And that's an example, like I said to you, when a place is defaced over and over, or there's threats over and over. The pandemic has been ongoing wounding. I think when it first happened, people thought of it as a devastating event. Clearly, it's ongoing wounding. It has caused all kinds of ruptures and changes, some of which have proven to be effective, and some have been pretty terrible and really difficult. Ongoing wounding can also be cumulative. It can like stack on top of, and that can feel just so pressured. And ongoing wounding, when someone looks, for example, at a man or a woman who's been beaten up by their spouse, they may think of it as a single devastating event. But for the person beat up, they may think of it as ongoing wounding. It's probably happened before. Now they're threatened that it will happen again. And it changes, makes you hyper vigilant. The third is the empathic nature of the work. And what that means is that we use empathy. Empathy is our tool for how we engage with people. I mean, we want teachers who work with young children to have empathy with them and for them. We want them to have compassion with them and for them. We want to have that for one another. Counselors, nurses, teachers, anybody in helping professionals who rely on empathy, that empathic nature of our work means that we're open. Our hearts are open. And that means we can get flooded emotionally. We can get flooded with trauma material. We can get flooded with, we don't even know what that is, but some child is acting out from some kind of trauma. And we're getting those feelings and that impact. And then there's the redemptive nature of the work. And this comes out of the civil rights movement and writings from the 60s. The redemptive nature of the work says we set really high ideals. We say, this is where we want to be. We want to be empathetic and compassionate, and we want no children to suffer. All right, this is where we want to be, and this is where we are. And we want to understand trauma at every level, and this is where we are. And there's this tension here that if you were to put a rubber band between my hands and pull, It's actually a hard tension. And for some people, it's a tension that they cannot hold. Simply don't have the capacity. It's too much. People will say to me, we're not walking our talk. And I'll say, well, you probably are, but where you want to be is so much further away. Or people say to me, I can't deal with this anymore. We don't come from a strong anti-oppression lens, or we're not taking on anti-racism as strongly as we need to be. Well, you know what? That may all be true. And the ideal is really high. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to assess where we are. Where is our culture now? Where do we want to be? And then what are the steps to get there? What we don't want to do is go into blaming ourselves and one another. We won't get there then. We will, in fact, implode. When people ask me, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for me in my work? What does it mean for my team? So one of the first things I say is, please pause. Well, what I'm asking people to do is, rather than react, to pause, to take a deep breath, and let's collectively come together and imagine. We know that when there is trauma, when there's organizational trauma in particular, we need to name it. We need to contain it. We need to collectively make meaning about it, and then decide what action we're taking. And what happens is that there will be an event and people want to know how to act. And we need a little bit of time and space in there. If you want to act immediately, all right, let's think about how we contain this. So for example, when there's a school shooting, right? Afterward, they get the children out, they figure out what counselors to bring in, they want to know what to do with families. And hopefully that whole process gets repeated again a month later, when the shock is worn off and people can come together. I remember working with a group of boys, and one of the 11-year-olds had died. And this group of boys, oh my gosh. So they start out saying, well, if he's not really dead, I think he should be in trouble because he wasn't supposed to be there. So that's where they started. And I thought, that protects their hearts, right? Well, maybe he's not really dead. Maybe he's just in trouble. Okay, so no, he is, in fact, he's really dead. And I said, I didn't know him. So can you tell me stories about him? That's collective meaning making. And it's so interesting. I did this with a group of girls as well, with a girl who had died. And what I found so interesting about it was that even the girls who didn't know her very well and the boys who didn't know him very well, they wanted to tell a story. Sometimes I'm not even sure the story was real. It doesn't matter, right? It's that collective meaning making, right? And letting them each know they got heard. And then we can figure out what it is we're going to do. Are we going to, well, depending on the community, right? If it's a faith community, is there a prayer we want to write or say about this person? Do we want to write a letter to the family? Do we want to draw pictures and just know that our hearts are carrying those images? What's the ritual that's appropriate for the group and the age? So when I'm working with like teachers and there has been a situation and they say, what do we do? Again, I say pause. And one of the teachers said to me just a couple of weeks ago, I said, pause. Okay, everybody take a deep breath. And she said, oh my gosh, my shoulders were up by my ears, right? We're carrying it, we embody it. So let's stop. Let's just stop. Everybody bring it down a little bit. All right, remember, trauma isolates. How do we connect? I talk slowly. I lower my voice some. I let people know that I'm holding and containing the situation with them. Then we can talk and share stories or not. And we can go from there to, what does this mean now for us and for our community? Is there something we want to learn more about? Is there something we want to be offering to our families? How do we want to talk about this with kids? Where are we going from here? I don't pretend that I know what their answer is, right? We come back to organizational culture. What are the values held in the culture? How can we build on those values and strengths so that we move through this trauma that we've experienced collectively? Let's move through it collectively.